Another day, another movie to talk about, and another one where I'm gonna rant for a bit. I think I'm gonna ramble. Today, I'll be talking about The Long Walk, which just came out the 12th of this month, and it is a horror. I would personally classify this as like dystopian future horror. At least the novel was, and I guess this kind of is too. This is 1 hour and 48 minutes long and rated R for strong bloody violence, grisly images, unaliving oneself, and pervasive language and sexual references. I wonder if this is included in grisly images. I will say, especially if you aren't familiar with the source material on this one, that there are bodily functions in this, like pooping. There's pooping in this, so just just yeah. Okay. This was directed by Francis Lawrence, who did the 2005 Constantine, starring Keanu Reeves. He also did I Am Legend and is mostly known for doing The Hunger Games. He did Catching Fire along with Mockingjay 1 and 2 and the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. And I believe he's also doing the other prequel movie. I don't know what it's called. But so yes, very big into the Hunger Games. Makes sense that he would be doing this. He did not write it. It was written by J.T. Molnar. J.T. Molnar wrote and directed Strange Darling from 2 years ago, last year. Great movie. I might do a video on it actually. And he wrote and directed it, but he only wrote this one. He did the adaptation because it is based on a story by Stephen King. The only other thing that I saw that he had written and directed was Outlaws and Angels. I've never seen that, so I can't really say if it was good or anything. I don't know that I even knew that movie existed until I looked up J.T. Molnar. A lot of actors to go through here, so we'll go pretty quickly because most of them don't have a lot of movie credits. A lot of them are younger actors or unknown actors. So first off, we have Cooper Hoffman as Ray Garrity. He was in like Licorice Pizza whenever he was younger. We have David Johnson as Peter McVries, and he was in Alien Romulus last year, and I think he's going to be in the Romulus sequel, I think. Is that a spoiler for Alien Romulus? Anyway, Garrett Werning as Stebbins. He was in the Pretty Little Liars, The Professionals, and Manifest TV show. Then we have, I believe it's Tut Yodas as Art Baker or Arthur Baker. He was in an episode of The Witcher Blood Origins. I never watched that because it was not canon, so I didn't care to see it. Then we have Charlie Plummer as Gary Barkovich, and he's been in some things before. He was one of the only names I recognized from this as far as the younger actors. He was in Boardwalk Empire. He was in The Clove Hitch Killer years ago. He was in Moonfall, which is hilarious if you know anything about Moonfall or a fan of Moist Critical. We have Ben Wang as Hank Olson, who was in Karate Kid Legends. As far as the adults in this, there aren't many, but we have Mark Hamill as the Major. It's Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker, and the voice of the Joker for the Bruce Timm animated Batman. It's Mark Hamill. And then we also have Judy Greer as Ginny Garrity, who is Ray's mom. And Judy Greer has been around for a while, since the late 90s, doing stuff. She was Jawbreaker, I think was the first thing I remember seeing her in. And then, she's done tons of TV cameos. She was in Jurassic World. She's an Ant-Man. She was in The Village. I mean, she again is a very known actress, which is interesting because, we have all of these unknown or very little known actors who played like the younger characters in this. And then we had Mark Hamill and Judy Greer. I just thought it was kind of interesting because he said that Charlie Plummer was the only of the younger actors that I really knew much about. I didn't really recognize Johnson from Alien Romulus until like afterwards when I looked him up and I was like, oh yeah, I knew he looked familiar. But yes, so Mark Hamill and Judy Greer, very well known actors, and a lot of younger talent and lesser known people in this, which is always kind of nice to see. As I mentioned, this is based on the novel by Stephen King. I mean, technically, it's the novel by Richard Bachman, which is Stephen King. And Stephen King did work as a producer on this one. He was a producer on this film, and he actually did have input into some of the things. I've seen some interviews and things, or just some quotes and things from him, that he didn't just sign off on this and let them go with it. He actually was part of the process of this and involved in making it. This is going to be a little different. I'm going to go over a review like I normally do. And then afterwards, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth. So if you just want to know my general thoughts on the movie, I'll get those out of the way. And then we'll talk about it more in depth. So the pros, the acting. Yes, there are a lot of greener actors in this, a lot of lesser known actors in this. They're all fantastic. Every single character in this, the actor nails the character. It's actually trimmed down to the point where this is almost like a character study. So if the acting wasn't as good, this would be unwatchable. And it isn't. It isn't unwatchable. And it's because, yeah, these actors play these characters so well and make them relatable and enjoyable to watch and really feel authentic as the characters. And that is really saying something because, like I said, a lot of these guys don't have a lot of acting credits. And so it's nice to see them put, the Lawrence and King and Milner put lesser known actors who are very talented in this. I thought that all the actors did a great job. I really, really enjoyed their performances. The other thing is that there are some very, very emotionally impactful scenes in this. There are scenes that really carry a lot of weight to them when dealing with the subject material of what this movie is. And I think that, yeah, there were a couple scenes in this that affected me. And if you've ever listened to any of my stuff before, you know that that doesn't happen a ton for me. I sympathize with characters and stuff, but I don't get emotionally invested in things that often. So it was nice to have a little bit more of an emotional feeling towards these characters, even though going in we know they're like all gonna die. All right, so the cons. Editorially speaking, narratively speaking, there were choices that were made in this that I feel like they limit the impact of this movie. I feel like the narrative is uneven and it leads to kind of a confused overall purpose and message to this movie. I'm not sure the filmmakers really knew what they wanted to say. This movie is almost 2 hours long and it feels 2 hours long, but it also feels really kind of choppy in some places. It's an odd mix, and like I said, I feel like that's because the filmmakers didn't necessarily know what they wanted to do, if that makes sense. I don't know that that's quite. There's a message that they wanted to put in this movie, and they dance around it a lot, I think. Or there were multiple messages they put and they couldn't decide which one, and therefore everything gets confused. I'm honestly not sure which one. This kind of disconnected narrative leads it to be it almost feels like a series of vignettes more than like a narrative in some ways. And because it's just is choppy in a weird kind of way. They made some weird decisions there. I think it makes it a little less impactful in some ways. So that's the basic kind of pros and cons there. Overall, I think that this movie's worth a watch. I ultimately basically enjoyed my experience watching this one. I think that because of the confusing narrative and some of the less than perfect editorial choices, that this is one that no one's going to remember. I think it's something that some people, especially fans of King, have wanted to see for a while, and now it's out and it exists, and in 5 years, no one's going to remember it was ever made. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I know that I have not personally seen or talked to a lot of people who even really care about it. So I don't know that it's going to have a lot of longevity. And some of that boils down to the aforementioned editorial choices that they decided to make with this. So that's my basic idea of the movie. I think it's worth a watch. I think that it has some very high emotional impact. The acting is superb. It just falls short. So now, because I have read recently the novel it's based on, I thought I would go into things that really could have made this movie stand out a little more. This is The Long Walk. It has long been valued, or it has long been said to be Stephen King's first book, and that is true because he wrote it before he wrote anything else. He did not publish Carrie until the early 70s, but he wrote this whenever he was a student at the University of Maine, which was in the late 60s. It was not published, however, until 1979 under the pseudonym of Richard Bachman. Now, if you don't know much about Stephen King and Richard Bachman, yes, they are the same person. But the thing is, King, once he became a published author, there were certain expectations of him, and he couldn't necessarily write everything he wanted to write. There were things that he could not write as Stephen King because his publishers were like, no, you can't do that. So he created Richard Bachman. If you've ever read The Dark Half, that is about Richard Bachman. King never really wanted people to know that Bachman was him, and The Dark Half was written as basically a way to kill Bachman off because he's like an alter ego of Stephen King. King with Bachman could write things that he couldn't publish as Stephen King, and because of that, a lot of the stuff that Bachman, or was written under the Bachman name, is actually now a lot of it has been converted over to Stephen King. It's been republished under King's name. But a lot of the things that were written under the Bachman pseudonym, including this one, are extremely bleak and nihilistic, more so than King's other works. And if you know anything about King, that says a lot. Yeah, okay, this is not feel-good literature. That's kind of where this comes from. That's where this starts. It is a Stephen King novel. It was, like I said, it was the first thing he wrote, but he did not publish it until later. And in a lot of ways, you can kind of tell that it was an early work of his and that it was written by someone who was very young. But the novel, in my view, has two main themes. And the first and the most obvious one, the one that lots of people talk about, is that it is a metaphor for the Vietnam War. It was, like I said, it was written in the late 60s, and it was written by a young man who was seeing his friends be drafted and sent to a war that a lot of people didn't agree with, and there was a very sensationalized component to it. The Long Walk is a metaphor for being drafted, going to war, going through war, getting through war, being one of the only survivors of it, and yet still not getting out unscathed because PTSD exists. And just because you're not fighting anymore doesn't mean the war is over for you internally. Like I said, it's a very pessimistic, very nihilistic way of looking at the military and military service, war in general, through the eyes of a young person who was dealing with a very, very bad time in, world history with the Vietnam War. That's the first metaphor. That's the biggest metaphor. That's the one that a lot of people talk about. And then there's the other metaphor. And the other metaphor is that the long walk is life. There are phrases that are used in the novel about how no one survives the walk, because the whole point of the walk is that they're supposed to have, these boys, and they walk, and whoever is the last one wins the prize of like infinite wealth, and he gets a wish. But it is brought up multiple times in the novel that you don't survive the walk, and you basically have to be suicidal to participate in it, and that nobody survives it. And that is life. That the experiences along the way, the things that happen, good and bad, are the point of the walk rather than the ending of the walk. And that is the second kind of metaphor, because that is life. That is, again, a kind of it is a nihilistic, very bleak way to look at life, but that is Richard Bachman. And that is when you have an entire population, you have a whole, countries going through the things that were happening at the time this was written, you do tend to have a very pessimistic view of things. And that's the other metaphor here, is that the walk is life, just in general, that everybody has to do the long walk, because that's living. In my completely non-professional personal opinion, this is where the movie falters. This is the biggest problem with the movie. They did not pick a side. They picked both. Okay. So I think if you had taken this movie, if you had taken this book, if you'd taken this story, and especially because we have the Francis Lawrence, who is very known for working with like the Hunger Games, and if you really leaned into the whole battle royal / Hunger Games, this is a dystopian future, basically created a world in which this walk exists, really focus more on the world itself rather than the walk, if that makes sense. Just go for it. Just be like, okay, we're going to do a completely updated version of this. We're going to tell a similar story in a different setting. Instead of having it be in relation to the Vietnam War, we're going to go with a future version of our current reality. I think that could have worked really well. Conversely, they could have gone the other way, and they could have said, okay, we're going to take a completely minimalist approach here, and we're going to do the metaphor that the walk is life. Really focus on the fact the point of it isn't the ending. The point of it isn't winning so much as it is participating in it. The journey that goes into it is what is the important part, not the outcome, because the outcome is the same for everyone. They did neither in both of these. It starts out very similarly to the novel. In the novel, we do not get a lot of backstory as to what really happened, that the United States is in this very bad dystopian state. We don't get a lot of backstory, a lot of information on the things that have happened that have led to this. It just exists. And that is the way the movie starts as well. We don't get informed as to what is happening, what led us here. It just is, which again would work very well with the metaphor for life thing. Anyway, the characters, for the most part, are very close to their book counterparts. There are some changes to varying degrees. They did some things where they kind of moved some plot points around. They moved some, like they combined some characters and kind of switched some traits and things around. But I feel like the characters that they focused on are true to their counterparts in the book. They're true to the characters that King wrote. Part of that is they had to make some adjustments because in the book there are 100 contestants at the start of the walk. In this, there are 50, one for each state for reasons. Again, not a lot of backstory on this. We don't really get a lot of information, filler information or world building in this. We don't know a lot about this world. That all lines up very similarly to the novel. And then we have the minimum speed in the novel has been changed. In the novel, it was 4 miles per hour they had to maintain. They could not fall below that without getting a warning. And that's like jogging speed, right? For like 5 days to jog. It's just not sustainable. And King himself said about whenever they were making this, he's like, we're going to lower it to 3 miles per hour because, yeah. um, 4 is just, listen, it was the 60s. I don't know what I was doing. And when you're, when you're that age, you think you're Superman. No, I don't know. But they did lower it to 3 miles per hour, which is, much more manageable, and also is fun because they had the marketing for it where they had the showing in, I think it was LA, where they had people on treadmills going 3 miles per hour during the whole movie, which I thought was just honestly a brilliant stroke of marketing. But anyway, another thing that is different in the novel, in order to participate in the long walk, in order to volunteer for it, you have to be between 16 and 18 years old. Most of the contestants in the novel are like 17. In the movie, it's like 18 plus. And I think that kind of helps because there are some characters in the novel that I think there are some characters that I think their story makes a little bit more sense in today's world with them being a little older. In the book, you had Scram, who was he was married and had a child on the way at 17. And while that does happen, that did happen then and it happens now, having them have a little bit more world experience makes this a little bit more impactful in some ways, because I think that aging the characters up a little bit makes them a little more relatable, a little more believable in some ways. And it allowed them to cut some of the more juvenile, we'll say, parts of the book out. As I said, this was written by a young man, and there are parts in the novel that I was really hoping would not make it into the movie because there's a big focus on, sexual kind of things and everything. And that I didn't feel that was necessary for the movie. Not that I'm a prude by any means, but I was kind of like, this is going to be interesting. There are several scenes from the novel that are almost exactly in the movie. Some of them are not in the same order as they are in the novel, but they are present. Some of them, again, have different characters involved in them. And like I said, they're kind of moved. Some of them are moved around in the chronology of the story, and I think that makes at least one of them less impactful. But they are there, and they are very true to the novel, which, that's always nice to see. But I think that also adds to the feeling of it being almost more like vignettes rather than a straight narrative. I think there were better ways that they could have linked some of this stuff together. Yes, is basically what I'm saying there. The other big change from the book is they completely remove the audience component. In the novel, this is something that everybody watches. Like this is a spectacle, and that plays into the metaphor of it being, the draft and Vietnam. And it's a very public thing. It's like a very public lottery. These kids were chosen for this, and then the entire thing is televised. There's even talk in the book of betting odds in Vegas for which one will win. And when they go through towns, the streets are lined with fans and, young girls with signs of their favorite walkers and just all different kinds of things that could have broken up some of the tedium of the movie. Okay, so part of the point of this movie is the long, it's supposed to be kind of tedious because we're supposed to be sympathizing with these characters. So it's long and boring in some ways, but also if they had included some of these scenes with the audience to break up the tedium, I think it would have come across a lot better. I think the movie would have been a better watch, a more enjoyable watch. I understand the limitations that they were facing with a lot of this, and to make it more minimalistic like they did kind of works for some of the changes they made to the story, but I also feel like completely removing the audience component when they could have gone the other way and really made it like a big thing. Like maybe have some of the audience members were like, oh, this guy is a big threat to my guy, so I'm gonna try and distract him and get him to go off. Not that that needed to be a thing or anything, but like, or even like, having sponsors like in the Hunger Games or something. I just think there was a lot of opportunity that they could have played with there, and they just decided to just completely nix that part of it. The thing about that is basically the way they explain it away is the major says, oh, they can all watch it on TV, so they don't need to see it in person. Like there are some places along the walk where they go through towns and stuff like that, and there are people that live in the towns that are watching along the road, but none that are it's not like it is in the book. And there's even a big thing about a discussion between McVrees and Garrity, and Garrity being disgusted by the crowd, or the very few crowd there are, and McVrees saying, these are just people, and they're doing what they're told to do, just like we are. Whereas in the book, there's a lot of animosity towards the crowds at certain points, and I think having the crowds would have played well into a very dystopian future Hunger Games-esque version of this. I understand, narratively speaking, and especially with the way they did McVree's character in this, why they had this specific scene, and maybe that's the entire reason that they decided to have a lack of crowds. But yeah, it made the movie seem pretty long. Pretty long, yeah. And honestly, the scene that I just talked about is pointless anyway because of what they ended up doing with McVrees at the end anyway. Overall, the biggest problems I have with this movie are threefold. Okay, so the first one is that the only real antagonist we have in this is the Major. Okay, in the book, Barkovich is an antagonist. He is very like sadistic, and like they even say in the book, I think it's Stebbins even says like, I think the only reason he joined the walk was so that he could, basically watch other people die. So yeah, in the novel, he's extremely narcissistic. He doesn't care who he has to step on. He wants to win. This version starts out kind of that way, but once the encounter with Rank happens in the novel, Barkovich becomes ostracized by the majority of the group, and that over time wears on him mentally to the point where he ends up going insane and ripping out his own throat. In the movie, he is like immediately regretful from that point on. Yeah, he does have some antagonistic tendencies, but he isn't like the antagonist. He very quickly and very abruptly says that he didn't mean for what happened to Rank to happen, and he isn't a bad guy, and he tries to kind of ingratiate himself to the Musketeers, and who are the group of good guys, the group of friends. Ultimately, yes, the ending for Barkovich is largely the same, except that he just kind of offs himself in the movie in front of them. They make him a lot more sympathetic in the movie than he is in the book. It makes it so that there's literally like the Major and the squads are like the only real quote unquote bad guys in this movie. The walk itself and the Major are more of the enemy than anything else, and I think that is a missed opportunity because Barkovich, while a reprehensible character, adds to the story because he is an antagonist who is walking with them. He is actively involved in the walk. I think that not having him be truer to his character was a failing. That is not saying it was a failing of the actor at all. That was completely the way he was written. Charlie Plummer did an absolutely amazing job playing him and making him very sympathetic and portraying his kind of mental instability and his insecurity. So that is not a comment on the actor who played him at all. That is purely about the way his character was written and how he was changed from the novel. Like I said, all of the actors in this did amazing, and I would not put any failings of this movie on any of them. I think that because they made Barkovich not be as big of a threat and as big of an antagonist, they needed to make the Major more of an antagonist. I think so. As a way to counter that, that is where the second biggest change comes in, and that is with Ray Garrity's character. Our main character, Ray Garrity, is given basically not a completely different backstory, but almost. And actually, both he and McVrees are given very different backstories than they have in the book. Ultimately, they are very similar to their book counterparts as far as their characterizations, but their histories are very different. Book Ray, whenever he was young, his dad was squatted. And what that means is we don't know what that means. Basically, the squads came in, they took dad, and he never saw him again. Dad could be alive, dad could be dead. We don't really know. This all happened when Garrity was rather young, so he doesn't really remember his dad very well. He just knows that his dad had some political views that were against the totalitarian government, and that got him squatted. He doesn't know what happened to his dad. We don't know what happened to his dad. Additionally, he had a younger brother, I think it was, that died whenever he was very young, and that is not mentioned in this at all. In the book, he has his mom. It has been him and his mom since his brother died and his dad was squatted. And he also has his girlfriend, Jan. Jan is a big driving factor for him. She's a big motivation for Ray because, you know, she at the beginning, and this is part of the talking about streamlining some of the stuff with the, you know, the sexy time horniness of teenage boys thing. In the novel, Jane has not wanted to give up her virginity, but, you know, she kind of like tries to tempt Ray, like, oh, I'll, you know, if you don't go, we can finally be together kind of thing. He doesn't fall for that, but it is something that he thinks about later. As time goes on, he really starts to idolize his girlfriend and see her as a driving force for him, and kind of falls, or at least he thinks he falls deeper in love with her, and that she is why he is doing this. Because in the book, he doesn't really understand why he's done this. He joined it as a compulsion, I guess, but didn't really put a lot of thought into it because he's 17 years old, and this is something that you do. That's another big kind of thing from the book. Like I said, there are 100 people in the book and there are volunteers and stuff, but in the movie, they make a big point about how, yes, it's a choice, but like everybody puts in for it. Everybody tries to get on the long walk. It's the illusion of choice. There isn't actually a choice there, and that is completely fabricated for the movie. I understand what they were going for with it because Garrity is the one that brings this up, and he is almost like a revolutionary in some ways because of what happened to his dad. So in the movie, Ray's dad was big into exposing him to things that the government had considered illegal, arts and philosophy and things like that the government said, no, it's V for Vendetta in here. You don't you don't mess with that stuff. His dad must have been at least a little bit outspoken or very bad at hiding the fact that he had this contraband, because a squad shows up and drags dad outside and the major's there, and the major says, you have to pledge allegiance to the state and say about how corrupt and awful these other things are. And he looks directly at his son and says that he will not do that, and he gets shot in the head right in front of Garrity and Ginny. He sees that as the major taking his dad, but McVrees points out that that was not the major doing that. His father left him, and Ray eventually does come to see this point that his father's actions, while potentially moral and noble, led to him and his mom being alone. Also in the movie, he is much older when his dad is taken, so he has more of a connection with his dad than he did in the book. So that makes more sense, because as opposed to not having really a motive in the book, Garrity in the movie, he intends to win the walk and ask for a gun and shoot the major in front of everybody. So it's a revenge plot. He gets a revenge story. That is his whole thing, is he wants revenge against the major for killing his dad. McVrees, in his wisdom, says, that's stupid. You're gonna die, dude, and then your mom's gonna be alone. This is kind of a thing that, over time, Garrity does seem to agree with and understands that he did to his mom exactly what his dad did to his mom, and that is not good. That is not the way to do it. That in joining this, he basically knows he's gonna die. He just willingly left his mom, and now she's gonna be alone. That's impactful. It's a big change for Garrity. The whole revenge thing against the major was not necessary, and I'll get into that later, because it just kind of muddies things up. I don't know that you needed that extreme in order to get the point across that Garrity is just doing what his dad did. He's just following kind of in his dad's footsteps in a way that is unhealthy and not good. So that brings us to McVreeze. Now, in the novel, McVreeze is very sarcastic and can be kind of a bully at times. He is very much a realist. He had a falling out with a girlfriend. He tried to assault her. She defended herself, and that's how he got his scar. And he has a lot of shame over that. He also has had a falling out in the past with I believe it was girlfriend, that was over money. So he feels that if he were to win, that it would solve a lot of his problems. He is very self-loathing. He is suicidal. The reason he joins the walk is because he wants to die. Even with that, in the book, he becomes very much a guiding force and a moral compass and a savior to Garrity. He saves Garrity's life multiple times. And okay, so in the book, it's not said expressly that McVreeze is bisexual, but he flirts with Garrity, and it seems kind of like he falls in love with Ray over the course of the walk. It is very important to him that Ray survives the walk. So I guess the way to put it is that the book version of McVreeze is very similar. He has a very similar role. Ultimately, what really undoes Garrity at the end, it is down to him and Stebbins and McVreeze sits down and leaves, and that kind of breaks Garrity. The only reason Garrity wins is because Stebbins falls over dead. Even at that, he doesn't really win because he still sees a dark figure up the road and he just keeps walking. I'll come back to that in a minute. McVreeze dying, it's the point at which Garrity kind of loses it in the book, because he is so much of kind of like a moral compass, even though he's not really that moral. So in the movie, they decided to go a different way with McVreeze. He is very much the same character in a lot of ways, but he has a lot of differences in his outlook on life. He does kind of admit he joined this full knowing he's probably going to die. He has nothing in his life. He has no family. He has nothing. So why not try to win the walk and then use his wish to help people who are in situations like he was when he was younger? Because in this version, his parents died in the war, and then his scar came from someone who he got into a fight with, and then he woke up in the hospital. And this version of McVreeze has a much more positive view of life in general. He's the one that tells Garrity, the people who are there watching, the families that are watching the walk, that is love. They aren't doing it out of spite, out of anger. They shouldn't be hated because there's love there. He also says about that you should use the wish to do something good. When he talks about his past and he tells Garrity about what happened, he does so to distract Garrity because Garrity is thinking about giving up. His entire story here, his entire monologue, and David Johnson's delivery of it is so wonderfully done and so impactful, and just makes you kind of fall in love with McVreeze's character. He is so pure and so good, and he has nothing and yet wants to win this so that he can not only have whatever he wants, but he wants to be able to help people. And he very much tells Garrity that revenge is not a reason to do this walk. It's the old, when you want revenge, make sure to dig 2 graves kind of thing, because you're not going to make it out alive. McVreeze also in the movie thinks that Garrity should win. Right. So like I said, he's different. He's much more altruistic. He's much more pure, but he fulfills the same role. And McVreeze is my favorite character in the book. And this version of him I also loved. And of course, when he was giving his speech to Garrity about this, I was thinking that this movie was going to end like the book does. And in the book, as I already said, McVreeze dies. He's the second runner-up and he dies. And so when he was giving this very impassioned speech, I was expecting him to die. Not that much in the future. That is not ultimately what happens. Which brings me to the ending and the choices they made with the ending. And yes, my eye is twitching because why did they do this? Okay, so like I said in the book, it comes down to McFreeze, Stebbins, and Garrity. Stebbins is actually the illegitimate son of the Major and wants to win so that he can request to be part of the Major's household. He calls himself the Chase Rabbit. On some level, he doesn't believe the Major's going to let him not win. He knows so much about the walk that he's going to win it. This version of Stebbins is the same, but he gets sick in the book. Scram, who I mentioned earlier, who has the wife and child on the way, ends up getting sick and dying. Stebbins ends up getting largely his ending in that he gets sick and allows the squads to kill him. That brings it down to McFreeze and Garrity. Like in the book, McFreeze tries to sit down, and this happens a couple times in the book, and at one point in the book, Garrity does save him. He pulls him back up. In the movie, when McFreeze tries this, Garrity gets him up as well. But they are both at the third warning. Garrity basically tricks McFreeze so that the squads take Garrity out, and Garrity dies. I'm not a huge fan of the way the novel ends, the way the book ends. I think that there were probably, I understand why it ends the way it does. I think there were better choices, and we all know that Stephen King has issues with endings anyway. I think that there were probably more eloquent ways to end it. I was hoping that, much like with, The Mist by the amazing Frank Darabont, we would get a better ending. It would be different and it would be better than what King wrote. We didn't. So Garrity dies, sacrifices himself, which makes no sense. He made this decision that he wasn't going to be like his dad and abandon his mom, and then he does it anyway. And McFreeze, who wants Garrity to win because McFreeze has nothing to live for, ends up winning. And the Major, of course, is like, oh, what do you want for your wish? And McFreeze asks for a gun. And he wants a gun right now, and points it at the Major. And the Major has a great line where he says about, oh no, he's not going to shoot me. Yeah, because the Major knows what Garrity was planning, because the whole thing is televised, people. There were cameras on him the whole time. The Major is like, oh, go ahead and give him the gun because he's not going to shoot me. And then McFreeze shoots him, completely undoing everything that is good and pure about McFreeze's character. McFreeze then drops the gun, turns, and much like in the book, continues walking down the road. So there are a lot of interpretations in the book about what that means for Garrity. I'm personally of the opinion that when Stebbins dies and Garrity sees the dark figure ahead of him, there are lots of interpretations for what that is. It doesn't really matter because ultimately Garrity dies. They don't make a big deal in the book about any of the winners. There's like 2 of them mentioned, and both of them died either right after or not long after the walk ended. Again, this is where like the life metaphor comes in too. Both the metaphors I mentioned before, they come in, that even though you survive and you win, you don't survive, you die. I've always kind of taken the ending to mean that Garrity has like a mental break when McFreeze dies and then sees this figure. Stebbins falls over dead. Garrity continues. There's a point where, he's walking and he says he feels something on his shoulder. It's the Major is trying to tell him, oh, you've won. But then he says about that he even starts to run. And at that point, I believe it is because Garrity is dead. He has passed. And that is where he gets the energy to run. Going with that theory, that means that in this, I believe that, actually, I'm not entirely sure. So I had the idea that, okay, yes, he did shoot the Major and he got revenge for Garrity or whatever, and then they killed him, and that's the whole him turning and walking down the road like Garrity does in the book was their way of saying, oh, well, yeah, he died too. He chose the path of violence and decided to do the thing that he was supposedly so against, and then he died. I did see someone else talking about this, and they put forth a suggestion that from the moment he raises the gun at the Major, he died, that as soon as he made a move to shoot the major, that the guards killed him, that the squads killed him. And so him getting revenge and then turning and walking down, that none of that happened. It's possible that was the intent. I don't know for sure. I think in either case, he died at the end. And I don't know that it really matters, because in either case, they undid his character completely. And this is where I said about, they didn't know what message they wanted to deliver here, because number one, what's the point of McVrees winning over Garrity? There was no reason for that to happen, especially if you're going to have McVrees turn and do the exact same thing that he's been telling Garrity for literally days is not the right thing to do. I guess the point could be made that McVrees just kind of like snapped or whatever, but no, I just don't. I can appreciate that they tried to do something different, but yet still tie it to the novel. And I do appreciate that. You shanked it. There was just no reason for it to end the way it did. There was no reason to undo McVree's character like that. There was no reason to have this sloppy attempt at a twist. I expected going in that I wouldn't like the ending of this, because I'm not a fan of the ending of the novel. And I figured they would change it, and had hoped against hope that they would make a better ending. Nope, they didn't. As I said much earlier, I think this movie is worth a watch. I think ultimately it will be very forgettable for a lot of people, but I do think it is worth watching. The actors are just amazing in it. Seriously, give them all the awards, because they do such a fantastic job. Just know that, narratively speaking, this ain't it. I have to think for a while and think about what maybe the proper ending for this is. King tried, and now Molnar and Lawrence have tried. They haven't been able to get it right. I'd be interested to hear what other people think maybe a better ending would be. I understand why they ended things the way they did with the book, less so with the movie. I really don't know what the proper ending would be. I don't really have any ideas on that. That was a lot of talking. So if you're still here, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you sticking around for all of that. And I hope that I will see you in the next one. Thanks.